Son by Lois Lowry. Book 1. Before. 1. The young girl cringed when they buckled the eyeless leather mask around the upper half of her face and blinded her. It felt grotesque and unnecessary, but she didn't object. It was the procedure. She knew that. One of the other vessels had described it to her at lunch a month before. Mask? She had asked in surprise, almost chuckling at the strange image. What's the mask for? Well, it's not really a mask. The young woman seated on her left corrected herself and took another bite of the crisp salad. It's a blindfold, actually, she was whispering. They were not supposed to discuss this among themselves. Blindfold? She had asked in astonishment, then laughed apologetically. I don't seem to be able to converse, do I? I keep repeating what you say, but blindfold? Why? They don't want you to see the product when it comes out of you. When you birth it, the girl pointed to her bulging belly. You've produced already, right? She asked her. The girl nodded. Twice. What's it like? Even asking it, she knew it was a somewhat foolish question. They had had classes, seen diagrams, been given instructions. Still, none of that was the same as hearing it from someone who had already gone through the process. And now that they were already disobeying the restriction about discussing it, well, why not ask? Easier the second time, didn't hurt as much. When she didn't respond, the girl looked at her quizzically. Hasn't anyone told you it hurts? They said discomfort. The other girl gave a sarcastic snort. Discomfort, then. If that's what they want to call it, not as much discomfort the second time, and it doesn't take as long. Vessels? Vessels! The voice of the matron through the speaker was stern. Monitor your conversations, please. You know the rules. The girl and her companion obediently fell silent then, realizing they had been heard through the microphones embedded in the walls of the dining room. Some of the other girls giggled. They were probably also guilty. There was so little else to talk about. The process, their job, their mission, was the thing they had in common. But the conversation shifted after the stern warning. She had taken another spoonful of soup. Food in the birth mother's dormitory was always plentiful and delicious. The vessels were all being meticulously nourished. Of course, growing up in the community, she had always been adequately fed. Food had been delivered to her family's dwelling each day. But when she had been selected birth mother at 12, the course of her life had changed. It had been gradual. The academic course, math, science, law, at school became less demanding for her group. Fewer tests, less reading required. The teachers paid little attention to her. Courses in nutrition and health had been added to her curriculum, and more time was spent on exercise in the outdoor air. Special vitamins had been added to her diet. Her body had been examined, tested, and prepared for her time here. After that year had passed and part of another, she was deemed ready. She was instructed to leave her family dwelling and move to the birth mother's dormitory. Relocating from one place to another within the community was not difficult. She owned nothing. Her clothing was distributed and laundered by the central clothing supply. Her school books were requisitioned by the school and would be used for another student the following year. The bicycle she had ridden to school throughout her earlier years was taken to be refurbished and given to a different younger child. There was a celebratory dinner her last evening in the dwelling. Her brother, older by 6 years, had already gone on to his own training in the Department of Law and Justice. They saw him only at public meetings. He had become a stranger. So the last dinner was just the three of them, she and the parental unit who had raised her. They reminisced a bit. They recalled some funny incidents from her early childhood. A time she had thrown her shoe into the bushes and come home from the child care center barefoot. There was laughter, and she thanked them for the years of her upbringing. Were you embarrassed when I was selected for birth mother? she asked them. She had herself secretly hoped for something more prestigious. At her brother's election, when she had been just 6, they had all been very proud. Law and justice was reserved for those of especially keen intelligence, but she had not been a top student. No, her father said. We trust the committee's judgment. They knew what you would do best. And birth mother is very important, mother added. Without birth mothers, none of us would be here. Then they wished her well in the future. Their lives were changing too. Parents no longer, they would move now into the place where childless adults lived. The next day, she walked along to the dormitory attached to the birthing unit and moved into the small bedroom she was assigned. From its window, she could see the school she had attended and the recreation field beyond. In the distance, there was a glimpse of the river that bordered the community. Finally, several weeks later, after she was settled in and beginning to make friends among the other girls, she was called in for examination. Not knowing what to expect, she had been nervous, but when the procedure was complete, she felt relieved. It had been quick and painless. Is that all? She had asked in surprise, rising from the table when the technician gestured that she should. That's all. Come back next week to be tested and certified. She had left nervously. She wished they had explained everything more clearly in the instruction folder they had given her when she was selected. What does certified mean? She asked. The worker, putting away the examination equipment, seemed a little rushed. There were probably others waiting. Once they're sure it implanted, he explained impatiently, then you're a certified vessel. Anything else? He asked her as he turned to leave. No? You're free to go then. That all seemed such a short time ago. Now here she was, 9 months later, with the blindfold strapped around her eyes. The discomfort had started some hours before intermittently. Now it was non-stop. She breathed deeply as they had instructed. It was difficult, blinded like this. Her skin was hot inside the mask. She tried to relax, to breathe in and out, to ignore the discom. No, she thought. It is pain. It really is pain. Gathering her strength for the job, she groaned slightly, arched her back, and gave herself up to the darkness. Her name was Claire. She was 14 years old. 2. They clustered around her. She could hear them when her mind was able to focus through the surging intermittent pain. They were talking urgently to each other. Something was wrong. Again and again, they checked her with their instruments, metallic and cold. A cuff on her arm was inflated, and someone pressed a metal disc there, at her elbow. Then a different device against her stretched and shaking belly. She gasped as another convulsive pain ripped through her. Her hands were tied on either side of the bed. She was unable to move. Was it supposed to be like this? She tried to ask, but her voice was too weak, mumbly and scared, and no one heard. Help me, she whispered. But their attention, she sensed, was not on her, not really. They were worried about the product. Their hands and tools were on her taut middle. It had been hours now since all this began, the first twinge, then the rhythmic, hardening pain, and later, the buckling on of the mask. Put her out. We'll have to go in for it. It was a commanding voice, clearly someone in charge. Quickly. There was a startling urgency to it. Breathe deeply, they ordered her, shoving something rubbery up under the mask, holding it to her mouth and nose. She did. She had no choice. She would have suffocated otherwise. She inhaled something with an unpleasantly sweet scent, and immediately the pain subsided. Her thoughts subsided. Her being drifted away. Her last sensation was the awareness, pain-free, of something cutting into her belly, carving her. She emerged to a new, different pain, no longer that throbbing agony, but now a broad, deep ache. She felt freed and realized that her wrists were unshackled. She was still on the bed, covered with a warm blanket. Metal rails had been lifted with a clanking sound, so she was protected on either side. The room was empty now. No attendants or technicians, no equipment. Only Claire, alone. She turned tentatively, assessing the emptiness of the room with her eyes, and then tried to lift her head, but was forced back by the pain the attempt caused. She couldn't look down at her own body, but carefully moved her hands to rest there on what had been her own taut, swollen belly. It was flat now, bandaged, and very sore. The product was what they had carved out of her, and she missed it. She was suffused with the desperate feeling of loss. "You've been decertified." 3 weeks had passed. She had been recuperated in the birthing unit for the first week, tended and checked, pampered a bit, actually, she realized. But there was an awkwardness to everything. There with her were other young women recovering, so there was pleasant conversation, a few jokes about being slender again. Their bodies, hers as well, were massaged each morning, and their gentle exercise was supervised by the staff. Her recuperation was slower, though, than the others, for she had been left with the wound and they had not. After the first week, they were moved to an interim place where they amused themselves with talk and games before returning 2 weeks later to the large familiar group of vessels. Back they went to the dormitory, greeting old friends, many of them larger in size now, their bellies growing as they waited, and taking their places again in the group. They all looked alike in their shapeless, smock-lined dresses with their identical haircuts, but personalities distinguished them. Nadia was funny, making a joke of everything. Miriam was solemn and shy. Suzanne was organized and efficient. As vessels returned following production, there was surprisingly little talk of the task. "How did it go?" someone would ask, and the reply would be a nonchalant shrug. "And all right, fairly easy," or a "right, not too bad," with the face indicating that it had not been pleasant. "Good to have you back." "Thanks. How are things here while I was gone?" "The same. 2 new vessels just arrived, and Nancy's gone." "What did she get?" "Farm." "Good. She wanted that." It was casual talk, inconsequential. Nancy had delivered her 3rd product not long before. After the 3rd, the vessels were resigned, farmed, clothing factory, food delivery. Claire remembered that Nancy had hoped for farm. She liked the outdoors, and a particular friend of hers had been assigned farm some month before. She hoped to spend the next part of her working life in the company of someone she enjoyed. Claire felt happy for her. But she was apprehensive about her own future. Although her memory was hazy, she knew that something had gone wrong at her own production. It was clear that no one else had ended up with a wound. She had tried, somewhat shyly, to ask the others, those who had produced more than once, but they seemed shocked and confused by her questions. "Is your belly still sore?" Claire whispered to Miriam, who had been in the recuperation place with her. "Sore?" "No," Miriam had replied. They were sitting beside each other at breakfast. "Mine is just where the scar is, when I press on it," Claire explained, touching her hands gently to the place. "Scar?" Miriam made a face. "I don't have a scar." She turned away and joined another conversation. Claire tried again, carefully asking a few other vessels, but no one had a scar. No one had a wound. After a while, her own ache subsided, and she tried to ignore the uneasy awareness that something had gone very wrong. Then she was called in. "Claire," the voice from the speaker announced at midnight while the vessels were eating. "Please report to the office immediately after lunch." Flustered, Claire looked around. Across the table was Elisa, a special friend. They had been selected the same year, both 12s at the same time. And so she had known Elisa through her school years. But Elisa was new here. She had not been inseminated as soon as Claire. Now she was in the early stages of her first production. What's that about? Elisa asked when they heard the directive. I don't know. Did you do something wrong? Claire frowned. I don't think so. Maybe I forgot to fold my laundry. They wouldn't call you in for that, would they? I don't think so. It's so minor. Well, Elisa said, beginning to stack her empty dishes, you'll find out soon enough. It's probably nothing. See you later. She left Claire still sitting at the table. But it was not nothing. Claire stood facing them in dismay as the committee told her of their decision. She had been decertified. Gather your things, they told her. You'll be moved this afternoon. Why? She asked. Was it because... Well, I could tell that something went wrong, but They were kind, solicitous. It wasn't your fault. What wasn't my fault? She asked, aware that she shouldn't press them but unable to stop herself. If you could just explain... The committee had shrugged. This thing happens. A physical problem. It should have been detected sooner. You should not have been inseminated. Who was your first examiner? He asked. I don't remember her name. Well, we'll find out. Let's hope it was her first error, so that she will have another chance. They dismissed her then, but she turned at the door because she could not leave without asking. My product? He looked at her dismissively, then relented. He turned to another committee member near him at the table and nodded to the papers in front of her, directing her to look up the information. What number was it? The woman asked him, but he ignored the question. Well, she said, I'll check by name. You're Claire? As if they didn't know. They had summoned her here by name. But she nodded. She moved her finger down a page. Yes, here you are, Claire. Product number 36. Oh yes, I see the notations about the difficulties. She looked up. Claire touched her own belly, remembering. The woman returned the paper to the pile and tapped the edges of the stack to make it tidy. He's fine, she said. The committee had glared at her. She corrected herself. I meant that it's fine. The medical difficulties didn't affect it. You'll be fine too, Claire, she added affably. Where am I going? Claire asked. Suddenly she was frightened. They hadn't yet said she was being reassigned, just decertified, so she would no longer be a birth mother. That made sense. Her body had not performed that function well. But what if decertified people were simply released, the way failures often were? But their reply was reassuring. Fish hatchery, the committee had told her. You're being moved there. They need help. They're short of workers. Your training will start in the morning. You'll have to catch up. Luckily, you have a quick mind. She dismissed her now with a wave of his hand, and Claire went back to the dormitory to gather her few things. It was rest time. The other vessels were all napping, the doors to their cubicle-like rooms closed. She thought as she packed the few personal items that she had. It was a he. I produced a baby boy. I had a son. The feeling of loss overwhelmed her again. 3. You'll be issued a bicycle. The man, his name tag said Dmitri, hatchery supervisor, gestured toward the area where bicycles were standing in racks. He had met her at the door, unsurprised by her arrival. Obviously, he had been notified that she was on her way. Claire nodded. Confined to the birthing unit and its surrounding grounds for over a year now, she had not needed any kind of transportation, and she had walked here, carrying her small case of belongings from the birth mother's area to the northeast. It wasn't far, and she knew the route, but after so many months, everything seemed new and unfamiliar. She had passed the school and saw children at their required exercise in the recreation field. None seemed to recognize her, though they looked curiously at the young woman walking along the path at midday. It was unusual. Most people were at their jobs. Those who needed to be out and about were on bicycles, making their way from one building to another. No one walked. A small girl with hair ribbons grinned at Claire from the exercise routine and waved surreptitiously. Claire smiled back, remembering her own beribboned days, but an instructor called sharply to the child, who made a face and turned back to the assigned calisthenics. Across the central plaza, she caught a glimpse in the dwelling area of the small house where she had grown up. Other people would live there now, couples newly assigned to each other, perhaps waiting for. She averted her eyes from the nurturing center. It was, she knew, where the products were taken after the birthing. Usually in groups, early morning most often. Once, sleepless at dawn, she had watched from the window of her cubicle and seen 4 products tucked into a basket loaded into a 2-wheeled cart attached to the back of a bicycle. After checking their security in the cart, the birthing attendant had ridden off toward the nurturing center to deliver them there. She wondered if her own product, her boy, number 36, had been taken to the nurturing center yet. Claire knew that they waited, sometimes days, occasionally weeks, making certain that everything was going well, that the products were healthy, to make the transfer. Well, she sighed. Time to put it out of her mind. She walked on, past the Hall of Law and Justice. Peter, whom she had once known as a teasing old brother, would be inside at work. If he glanced through a window and saw a young woman walking slowly past, would he know it was Claire? Would he care? Past the House of Elders, the place where the governing committee lived and studied, past small office buildings, past the bicycle repair shop, and now she could see the river that bordered the community, its dark water moving swiftly, foaming around rocks here and there. Claire had always feared the river. As children, they had been warned of its dangers. She had known of a young boy who had drowned. There were rumors, likely untrue, of citizens who had swum across, or even made their way across the high forbidden bridge and disappeared into the unknown lands beyond. But she was fascinated by it too, its constant murmur and movement, and the mystery of it. She crossed the bike path, waiting politely until 2 young women had paddled by. To her left, she could see the shallow fish-holding ponds and remembered how, as younger children, she and her friends had watched the silvery creatures darting about. Now she would be working here, at the hatchery, and living here too, she assumed, at least until when? Citizens were given dwellings when they were assigned spouses. Birth mothers never had spouses, so she had not thought about it until now. Now she wondered, was she eligible now for a spouse and eventually for? Claire sighed. It was troubling and confusing to think about such things. She turned away from the holding ponds, made her way to the front door of the main building, and was met there by Dmitri. That night, alone in the small bedroom she had been assigned, Claire looked down from her window to the darkened, surging river below. She yawned. It had been a long and exhausting day. This morning she had awakened in her familiar surroundings, the place where she had lived for so many months. But by midday, her entire life had shifted. She had not had a chance to say goodbye to her friends, the other vessels. They would be wondering where she had gone, but would likely forget her soon. She had taken her place here, been issued a name tag, and been introduced to the other workers. They seemed pleasant enough. Some, older than Claire, had spouses and dwellings, and left at the end of the day's work. Others, like herself, lived here, in rooms along the corridor. One, Heather, had been the same year as Claire. She had been a 12 at the same ceremony. Surely she would remember Claire's assignment as birth mother. Her eyes flickered in recognition when they were introduced, but Heather said nothing. Neither did Claire. There was nothing really to say. She supposed that she and the younger workers, including Heather, would become friends of a sort. They would sit together at meals and go in groups to attend community entertainments. After a while, they would have shared jokes, probably things about fish, phrases that would make them chuckle. It had been that way with the other vessels, and Claire found herself missing, already, the easy camaraderie among them. But she would fit in here. Everyone welcomed her cheerfully and said they'd be glad of her help. The work wouldn't be hard. She had been allowed to watch the lab attendants, in gowns and gloves, strip eggs from what they called the breeder fish, anesthetize females. A little like squeezing toothpaste, she thought, amused at the image. Nearby, other attendants squeezed what they told her was milk from the male. Then they added the creamy substance to the container that held the fresh eggs. It had to be very precisely timed, they explained, and antiseptic. They worried about contamination and bacteria. The temperature made a difference as well. Everything was carefully controlled. In a nearby room lit by dim red lights, she had watched another gloved worker look through trays of stacked fertilized eggs. "See those spots?" the worker had asked Claire. She pointed to the tray of glistening pink eggs. Claire peered down and saw that most of them had 2 dark spots. She nodded. "Eyes," the girl told her. "Oh," Claire said, amazed that already, so young and tiny that she could hardly think of it as a fish, it had eyes. "See here?" Using a metal tool, the girl pointed to a discolored eyeless egg. "This one's dead." Carefully, she plucked it from the tray with her forceps and discarded it in the sink. Then she returned the tray to its rack and reached for the next one. "Why did it die?" Claire asked. She found that she was whispering. The room was so dimly lit, so quiet and cool, that her voice was hushed. But the worker replied in a normal tone, very matter-of-fact. "I don't know. The insemination went wrong, I guess." She shrugged and removed another dead egg from the second tray. "We have to take them out so they don't contaminate the good ones. I check them every day." Claire felt a vague discomfort. The insemination had gone wrong. Was that what had happened to her? Had her product, like the discolored eyeless egg, been thrown aside someplace? But no, they had told her that number, 36, was fine. She tried to set aside her troubling thoughts and pay attention to the worker's voice and explanations. "Claire?" The door opened and it was Dmitri, the supervisor, looking for her. "I want to show you the dining room, and they have your schedule almost ready to give you." So she had continued her tour of the facility and been instructed in her next day's duties. Cleaning, mostly. Everything had to be kept spotless. And later she had had supper with a group of the workers who lived, as she would now, at the hatchery. They talked mostly about what they had done during recreation time. There was an hour allotted each day when they could do whatever they liked. Someone mentioned a bike ride and a picnic lunch along the river. Apparently, the kitchen staff would pack your lunch in a basket if you asked in advance. 2 young men had joined the ball game. Someone had watched repairs being done on the bridge. It was aimless, pleasant chat, but it served to remind Claire that she was freer now than she had been in a long time. She could go for a walk after lunch, she thought, or in the evening. Later in her room, thinking, she realized what she wanted to do when she had time. Not just an ordinary walk. She wanted to try to find a girl named Sophia, a girl her own age, a girl who had turned 12 when Claire did. They had not been particular friends, but acquaintances and schoolmates who had happened to share a birth year. But Sophia had been seated next to Claire at the ceremony when they were given their assignments. Birth mother, the chief elder had announced when it was Claire's turn to stand and be acknowledged. She had shaken the chief elder's hand, smiled politely at the audience, taken her official assignment papers, and gone back to her seat. Sophia had stood next. Nurturer, the chief elder had named Sophia. It had meant little to Claire then, but now it meant that Sophia, an assistant at first, probably by now fully trained, was working in the nurturing center, the place where Claire's product, her child, her baby, was being held and fed. Days passed. Claire waited for the right time. Usually the workers took their breaks in pairs or groups. People would wonder if she wandered off alone during a break. There would be murmurs about her and questions. She didn't want that. She needed them to see her as hardworking and responsible as someone ordinary, someone without secrets. So she waited, worked, and began to fit in. She made friends. One lunchtime, she joined several co-workers in a picnic along the riverbank. They leaned their bikes against nearby trees and sat on some flat rocks in the high grass while they unpacked the prepared food. Nearby, on the path, two young boys rode by on their bikes, laughing at something, and waved to them. "Hey, look," one boy was pointing. "Supply boat." Eagerly, the two youngsters dropped their bikes and scrambled down the sloping riverbank to watch as the barge-like boat passed, its open deck heavy with wooden containers of various sizes. Rolf, one of the picnickers, looked at his watch and then at the boys. "They're going to be late getting back to school," he commented with a wry smile. The others all chuckled. Now that they were finished with school, it was easy to be amused by the regulations that they had all lived by as children. "I was late once," Claire told them, because a groundskeeper slipped his hand when he was pruning the bushes over by the central offices. I stopped and watched while they bandaged him and took him off to the infirmary for stitches. "I used to hope I'd be assigned nursing attendant," she added. There was an awkward silence for a moment. Claire wasn't certain if they knew her background. Undoubtedly, there had been some explanation given for her sudden appearance at the hatchery, but probably they had been told no details. To have failed at one's assignment, to be reassigned, had something of a shame to it. No one would ever mention it if they did know. No one would ask. "Well, the committee knows best," Edith commented primly as she passed sandwiches around. "Anyway, there's an element of nursing at the hatchery. All the labs and procedures." Claire nodded. "Hatchery wouldn't have been my first choice," a tall young man named Eric said. "I was really hoping for law and justice. My brother's there," Claire told him. "Does he like it?" Eric asked with interest. Claire shrugged. "I guess so. I never see him. He was older. Once he finished his training, he moved away from our dwelling. He might even have a spouse by now." "You'd know that," Rolf pointed out. "You see the spouse assignments at the ceremony." "I've applied for a spouse," he added, grinning. "I had to fill out about 1,000 forms." Claire didn't tell him that she had not attended the last two ceremonies. Birth mothers did not leave their quarters during their years of production. Claire had never seen a vessel until she came one. She had not known, until she had both experienced and observed it, that human females swelled and grew and reproduced. No one had told her what birth meant. "Look," Eric said suddenly, "the supply boat's stopping at the hatchery." "Good. I put in an order quite a while ago." He glanced down at the riverbank, where the two youngsters were still watching the boat. "Boys," he called. When they looked up, he pointed to the watch on his own wrist. "The school bell is going to ring in less than 5 minutes." Reluctantly, they climbed back up the bank and went to retrieve their bikes. "Thank you for that reminder," one said politely to Eric. "You think the supply boat will still be there after school?" the other boy asked eagerly. But Eric shook his head. "They unload quickly," he told the boy, who looked disappointed. "I wish I could be a boat worker," they could hear one boy say to the other as they set their bikes upright. "I bet they go lots of places we don't even know about. I bet if I were working on a supply boat, I'd get to see." "If we don't get back on time," his friend said nervously, "we're not going to be assigned anything." Come on, let's get going. The boys rode away toward the school building in the distance. I wonder what he thought he'd get to see as a boat worker, Rolf commented. They began to tidy up the picnic and to pack away the uneaten food. Other places, other communities, the boats must make a lot of stops. Eric folded the napkins and placed them in the basket. They'd all be the same. What's so exciting about seeing a different hatchery, a different school, a different nurturing center, Edith interrupted them. It's pointless to speculate, she said in her terse, businesslike tone. Accomplishes nothing. Wondering is very likely against the rules, though I suppose it isn't a serious infringement. Eric rolled his eyes and handed Rolf a basket. Here, he said. Strap this on your bike and take it back, would you? I have to do an errand. I told the lab chief that I'd pick up some stuff at the supply center. Rolf, attaching the basket to his bike by its transportation straps, commented, It might be nice to travel on the river, though, just for the trip. Fun to see new things, even. He added facetiously, if you haven't wondered about them. Edith ignored that. Could be dangerous, Eric pointed out. The water's deep. He looked around, making sure they had collected everything. Ready to go back? Claire and Edith nodded and moved their bikes to the path. Eric waved and rode off on his errand. Even if it might be against the rules, some kind of infringement, it would be hard to know without studying the thick book of community regulations, though it was always available on the monitor in the hatchery lobby. But there were pages and pages of very small print, and no one ever bothered to look at it, as far as Claire could tell. There would be no way for anyone to get caught in the act of wondering, Claire thought. It was an invisible thing, like a secret. She herself spent a great deal of time at it, wondering. Pedaling back, she rehearsed in her mind, silently, how easy it would be to say in a casual voice, I have to run an errand. How she could slip away, it wouldn't take long, and ride over to the nurturing center to find Sophia and ask some questions.